Hello, my name is Tammy Stoneman. I am a fourth year student at Algoma University in Sault Ste. Marie. I am doing my placement with For a Safer Space, FASS, social work practice. And today we're going to talk about rural social work. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge the Robinson Huron Treaty and the land on which we gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe nations. Okay, so our outline. We're going to look at context to practice regarding rural and urban areas, definition of rural areas in Canada, a short video on the difference between urban and rural communities, how social work in rural areas is different than in urban areas, how one model of service delivery is problematic in rural social work, what social workers need to understand about small towns and rural areas. I'm also going to do a definition of dual relationships per the Ontario College of Social Work and Social Service Workers. And I'm going to end with dual relationships in point form from the OCS WSSW. Okay, so Pug and Cheers, right? There are 5 dimensions of rural social work that can be used to understand context in which social work is conducted. Geography, demography, economy, political and structural dimensions, community. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm only going to be looking at geography, economy, and community. So I'm going to start with the first definition from Stats Canada. There's 5 altogether. So rural and small towns refers to individuals in towns or municipalities outside the commuting zones of larger urban centers with 10,000 or more population. These individuals may be disaggregated into zones according to the degree of influence of a larger urban center. This is called census metropolitan area and census agglomeration influenced zones. Now, if you look over to the right, there are 4 other definitions. So OECD, which is Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, states rural communities refers to individuals in communities with less than 150 people per square kilometer. This includes the individuals living in the countryside, towns, and small cities, inside and outside of the commuting zones of larger urban centers. The second, it's the same company or same organization. Predominantly rural regions refers to individuals living in census divisions with 50% of the population living in OECD rural communities. This includes all census divisions without a major city. BEAL and non-metropolitan regions refers to individuals living outside metropolitan regions with urban centers of 50,000 or more population. So rural postal code, which is on the bottom, refers to individuals living outside metropolitan regions with the second character being 0 in their postal code. These individuals live in areas where there's no letter carriers, so there is no mail delivery like there is in an urban center. So each of these definitions emphasize different geographic criteria, such as population size, population density, labor market, context or settlement context. In the case of the rural and small town definition and the disaggregation into metropolitan influence zones, function is one criteria. In the sense of the way space is used, the degree of social and economic integration with a larger urban center. The rural postcode definition stands alone, based solely on Canadian postal delivery mode. Okay, so now we're going to watch a short video. I found it online. It was created by Professor Fangal Darwin. It basically is just what the difference between urban and rural is. All we need is some popcorn. Okay, so I just want to touch on the video just for maybe 2 seconds. I don't want people to think that living in a rural area means you're going to have tons of space and farmland galore, rolling hills. There is space. We do have farmland, but we also have a very short growing season. So the type of things we can produce in Northern Ontario and Northeastern Ontario, um, like milk, is one of the things that the dairy in Sault Ste. Marie um, delivers out to all the rest of Ontario. So I'm going to move on from the video. Okay, so how is rural social work different than urban social work? First of all, geography. It can be very difficult to live in rural areas. Northern and Northeastern Ontario. Because it's cold here, and we get a lot of snow in the winter normally, but we have a longer winter than other people. We have a shorter growing season, and everything is so spaced out. For example, I come from Blind River. If I wanted to go to the nearest city, so say I went to Sault Ste. Marie, I would have to spend an hour and a half in my car and then go back home. So 3 hours. And if I go to Sudbury, which is on the other side heading towards Toronto, I would have to be in my car for 2 hours, 2 hours back, which is 4 hours. That is a long way to go to a city. So when I say we have a lack of services available, that is a very true statement. But not only do we have a lack of services available, we have a lack of social workers in rural areas when we should have more social workers in rural areas. There's not a lot of programming that one or two social workers can do for a community of 3,400 people that may be suffering from COVID fatigue or, depression or things like that. Also, rural practices and perspectives often different in rural social work, as it is a different way of living if it's compared to a large city. It's a faster pace in the city where it's a slower pace in a small town. Indigenous worldviews and perspectives play a role in rural and remote social work. And for anybody wanting to work with Indigenous populations, you need to know what their worldviews are and their perspectives. We have fewer immigrants in rural areas, so there can be a lack of cultural diversity in northern regions, and I think that's a bad thing. Attitudes in rural communities and ethical issues like dual relationship pose a bigger risk because everybody knows everybody in a small town. So rural towns are not as accepting to outsiders. They tend to be more suspicious. They don't trust you until they get to know you better. Also, it costs more to deliver services here. And I'm just going to give you an example of a head of lettuce in Sault Ste. Marie. It was at $2.49. I was in Blind River just after New Year's, and a head of lettuce was $6. And they're an hour and a half away from the Sioux. So everything seems to be more expensive in rural and remote communities. I had somebody tell me, actually it was my sister, when she went to buy a bag of milk, she was working in Kashechewan, it cost $25. And it's like $4.29 here. It's crazy. So it does cost more. Using one model of service delivery, regardless of where people live, is problematic for rural social work practice. And this comes out of the book. Rural social work practice. Well, everything actually comes out of this book except for the stats scan. It's a really good read, and I suggest people, pick it up and read it. You'd learn a lot from it. But I'm just going to go over a few things. I'm going to skip a couple things here. In rural and remote areas, people drive hours, like, and I've already told you that, to seek out medical attention or to have medical treatment. I just gave you the example. Blind River, Sudbury, 2 hours away. Blind River, Sault Ste. Marie, 2 hours away. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. So what social workers need to understand about small towns and rural areas? Changes in local, regional, and international economies can have considerable social, political, and material repercussions in rural settlements. To understand how the economy and broader forces can change the lives of people living in rural areas. So it costs more to make steel here in Sault Ste. Marie than it does down south. PUC is higher here than it is down south. Also, they have access to transportation routes. It's a little more difficult here. However, we do have an industry, and it's Algoma Steel. We have to acknowledge that lack of employment opportunities contributes to poor mental well-being and mental health of individuals living in rural and remote areas. Kids are huffing in areas, and people are committing suicide. These are huge problems. Also, rural and remote areas can be boom and bust towns. They go in, they deplete the natural resources, and they're out. Blind River used to be one of the biggest lumber mills in the world in Ontario. Now it no longer exists. So that's how it can. They just deplete the resources and it's done. Also, another example, in northeastern Ontario, in Elliott Lake, we have the uranium mines. They were open for a pretty long time, I think about 25 plus years. And when they started to get lower grade uranium and uranium prices went up, they just left town, leaving all of their stuff behind. The tailings, things weren't cleaned up. It was not a good thing. Many people left Elliott Lake, and Elliott Lake then is now a retirement city. So now they have a lot of elderly in that area, or older adults, I should say. Many people in rural areas are seasonal workers, and small towns depend on small businesses. They also depend on tourism. COVID has hit everybody hard, especially the people living in rural areas. Ethical concerns can arise in small towns and rural remote areas regarding dual relationships. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. So actually, a few seconds. What is a dual relationship? Well, it's defined as a situation in which a college member, social worker, or social service worker, in addition to his or her professional relationship, has one or more other relationships with the client, regardless of whether this occurs prior to or during or following provisions of professional service. So for example, if I was to be a social worker in in Blind River, Ontario, I know 95% of the people. So in order to avoid a dual relationship, I could only service 5% of the people. That's crazy. You could never do that. there's not enough social workers. So I'm just going to end it with this from the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. You can see dual relationships in rural areas and towns can be very tricky to navigate. Dual relationships and guidelines of how to conduct yourself can be found in practice notes from the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. Boundary violations can easily occur with dual relationships. Some examples are sexual abuse, sexual harassment. Social workers are in a position of power with respect to a client. So they must take care to ensure clients are protected. And one way we protect clients is to protect their confidentiality. Well, social work agencies are normally located on main streets in rural Ontario, rural northeastern Ontario. So in Blind River, with a population of 3,400, if somebody is having a really hard time and wants to talk to a social worker, they won't go in and talk to a social worker if they see somebody they know, because it'll get around town. Oh, you know, so-and-so, I saw so-and-so going to the saw. I wonder if they're okay. And then it degresses from there. Also, college members do not engage in professional relationships that can constitute a conflict of interest for the client. And in small rural areas, that's hard to do, especially if you lived and were born and raised in them. So I want to thank you. Once again, I am a fourth year student at Goldman University working for a safer space FASS social work practice. And I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.